I had just set down the feed bucket when I noticed the shift in the air. Not the wind, not the creak of the barn door, but the stillness that comes when something living is close. Across the fence, a figure stood barefoot in the brittle grass. A girl so thin her dress hung like it might slide from her shoulders. She didn't flinch when our eyes met, didn't move until I stepped toward the porch. Somewhere beyond her, I caught the glint of a second figure, taller, slower moving with a careful watchfulness. They stopped short of the gate, as if crossing it might cost more than they had left to spend. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been faced with a choice that could not be taken back. My name is Elias Mercer, and for near 12 years, I've worked a strip of stubborn land at the far edge of Red Bluff. The soil gives just enough to keep me and a few chickens fed, the old mule fed and the cabin standing through winter. I wasn't born to it. I grew up in a small Illinois farming town where my father preached that a man's worth was measured in his word and the way he treated his neighbors. My mother kept a Sabbath table even in years when we had little, and she'd send bread to families worse off than us without a word about it in church. After the war, I carried those habits west, though the land here asks more than it gives, and most days you're too tired to think about much beyond the next chore. Life in Red Bluff runs on two kinds of money: the kind counted out in coins and land deeds, and the kind weighed in sweat and calluses. Out here on the ridge, mine's the latter. Folks in town, especially the new ones with railroad ties and fat purses, have a way of looking past you like you're part of the fence line. They talk of parcels to buy, routes to stake, timber to cut, as if the people already here are just another crop to move aside. I've learned to keep my dealings short, my needs few, and my name out of ledgers where it doesn't belong. For years it was a simple rhythm: rise before the sun, take coffee by the stove, walk the fence while the frost still clung to the grass. The only grave I tend is up on the low hill behind the cabin, marked with a plain cross I made myself when Clara passed. I've kept the place mended in her absence, though the walls creak louder in winter, and the north shed roof sags more each year. It's a quiet life, and I've let it be that way, telling myself it was better to stand apart than be drawn into troubles that aren't mine. But the frontier doesn't much care for your plans. Trouble can ride in plain sight or come walking barefoot across your field. That evening, with the light going fast and the wind picking up, I watched those two figures by the gate. Their clothes worn thin, their faces holding something I couldn't yet name. I knew they hadn't come for directions. I set my boots on the porch step and waited for them to speak. The wind had picked up just enough to push dry leaves along the fence line when the pair finally stepped forward. The smaller one clung to the taller woman's skirt, eyes darting from the mule to the cabin. I stayed on the porch, one hand resting against the rail, watching them cover the last few yards as if each step needed its own decision. When they stopped, the woman adjusted her shawl and met my eyes without flinching. "We ain't here for charity," she said. Her voice was even, but it carried the scrape of long miles and little rest. "Just need somewhere we can stop running a while." The girl pressed closer into her side, her bare feet shifting on the hard-packed dirt. I didn't speak right off. The bruises along the woman's collar showed even in the fading light, and the way her left hand trembled when she tightened her grip on the shawl told me enough. I stepped down, walked past them without a word, and swung the cabin door open. The hinges groaned, releasing the scent of coffee grounds and wood smoke into the evening air. I left the door wide and moved to stoke the fire. The woman hesitated, her gaze passing over my shoulders to the dark interior, then urged the girl inside with a gentle push. The room was warm from the afternoon's fire, the stove still holding heat. The plank floor creaked under their boots, hers worn thin, the girl's bare toes leaving faint marks in the dust. A chair sat close to the hearth, and the cot against the far wall held a folded quilt I'd set there earlier. I busied myself with the pot on the stove, sliding it to the hotter side. The smell of beans rose with the steam. They took the table without asking the woman on the far side with her back to the wall, the girl half perched on her seat knees, tucked in. I ladled beans into 3 bowls, set out bread, and poured coffee into a cup for her and warm milk for the girl. The only sound for a while was the quiet scrape of spoons and the small sighs of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. When the bowls were empty, the woman rose and carried them to the basin without being told. She rolled her sleeves, dipped her hands into the cold water, and began scrubbing with the kind of focus that left no room for words. I took the kettle off the hook and set it beside her, letting the rising steam ease the bite of the cold. The light outside had gone nearly blue by the time I unrolled another blanket and laid it near the stove. The girl's eyes followed the movement. She reached out to touch the edge, her fingers testing the weave before drawing back. The woman pulled her close, murmuring something I couldn't catch. The girl curled under the quilt not long after, eyes drifting shut in the flicker of the firelight. "You got a wife?" the woman asked after a spell. "No," I said. "Children?" I shook my head. She didn't press, just shifted her gaze to the flames. Her hands resting on the table were raw across the knuckles, the skin stretched tight. I took my chair near the stove, listening to the faint hiss of the logs. She spoke again, her voice lower now. "We came from over Baker's Ridge." She let the name sit there heavy as stone. I didn't ask for more. After a while, she lay down beside the girl, pulling the blanket over both of them. The fire settled to a glow, and the cabin was quiet except for the soft breathing from the cot. I stayed in my chair, boots on, coat still buttoned. It had been years since anyone else slept under my roof. The sound was unfamiliar, but it wasn't unwelcome. Morning light worked its way through the cracks in the shutters, laying thin stripes across the floor. I moved slow so as not to wake them, pouring coffee into my cup and standing near the window. The girl had shifted in the night, one small hand resting against her mother's arm. They didn't stir until I stepped out to tend the animals. The frost on the grass crunched under my boots. I scattered feed for the hens and broke the ice in the trough with the heel of my hand. The mule stamped once, impatient for oats. The work took longer than usual. My thoughts kept circling back to the 2 shapes by the fire. When I returned, the woman was at the basin. Again, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing the grain in the boards with her finger. "I can make breakfast," the woman said, looking up briefly. "Beans and eggs," I told her. "Ain't much else." "That'll do," she replied. She moved with a quiet familiarity, setting the skillet and stoking the fire. The smell of eggs soon joined the lingering smoke from last night. We ate without much talk, just the scrape of forks and the occasional shift of the chair legs on the floor. Afterward, she asked if I minded her gathering kindling from near the fence line. "Don't like sitting still when I've got hands," she said. I handed her my hat against the cold. The girl stayed inside, wandering the small space with an unhurried curiosity. She stopped at a shelf where an old tin toy sat, one I hadn't touched in years. Her small fingers hovered above it. "You ever seen one of those?" I asked. She shook her head. I wound it once, set it on the table, and let it clatter forward on its crooked path. She smiled for the first time, a quick, unsure thing, then let out a short laugh. It hung in the air even after she looked away. By midday, the woman returned with an armload of wood, her cheeks flushed from the wind. "Barn roof's loose on the north side," she noted as she set the kindling down. I pointed her toward the tools. We worked together for the next hour, her steady hands holding the boards in place while I hammered them down. She didn't ask about the cabin, and I didn't ask about the miles behind her. That night, stew simmered on the stove. The girl held her own spoon now, her hair neatly braided. The fire threw shadows across the walls as the 3 of us ate. Afterward, I stepped outside to smoke the sky scattered with cold stars. The woman joined me, arms crossed. "We've been running near 2 years," she said quietly. "Every time I think we're safe, something cracks." She stared out toward the dark ridge. "I ain't asking to stay for good, but I can work. I can keep the girls safe." I took a slow draw and let the smoke curl into the wind. "I don't regret letting you in," I said. She nodded once, then went back inside. I stayed out longer than the cold allowed, thinking on the truth of her words. When I finally stepped back into the cabin, the fire was banked low and the girl was asleep under the quilt. The woman sat nearby, mending a shirt I'd left on the back of a chair. The needle moved in steady arcs under her fingers, the lamplight catching the curve of her jaw. She didn't look up when I passed, and I didn't speak. But the air between us had shifted. Whatever had brought them here, they were no longer just passing through. The first real snow came in the night. By morning, the roof was capped white, and the air held that stillness that comes when the world is muffled under fresh powder. I'd been up before dawn, clearing the path from the porch to the barn. The woman Clara was already at the stove when I stepped back inside, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, stirring cornmeal into a bubbling pot. The girl May sat close to the fire, her braids neat hands wrapped around a tin cup. We ate with the quiet of folks who had work ahead. Clara washed the bowls while I set my coat and hat for the day's trip. Supplies had run thin flour salt lamp oil. The nearest trading post was near 10 miles over rough ground, but the snow was light enough still. Clara insisted on coming, saying she knew the weight of provisions better than I did. I hitched the mule to the sled, and we set out just as the pale sun reached above the ridge. The trail cut along the creek, its edges iced and glinting in the low light. Our breath hung in the air, and the sled runners hissed over packed snow. Clara kept her eyes ahead, though now and then her hand went to the scarf at her neck. She hadn't said more about Baker's Ridge, but I noticed how she scanned the bends in the trail as if expecting more than trees to appear. By midday, we reached the post, a low timber building with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of coffee and leather. Old Thomas Brigg, who ran the place, looked up from his ledger. "Didn't figure you for company," he said, eyeing Clara. She met his look without a word and moved toward the sacks of flour. We gathered what was needed: oil, flour, beans, a small tin of sugar. Clara slipped into the pile for May. At the counter, Thomas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Riders came through last week, asking after a woman with a young girl. Said she might have headed this way." His eyes flicked toward Clara, then back to me. I kept my voice even. "Plenty of women and girls pass these roads." "Maybe so," he said, wrapping the sugar in brown paper. "But these fellas didn't sound like they were offering a welcome." The words stayed with me on the way back. Clara sat with May on the sled, her hands tucked under the girl's blanket. The wind had picked up, cutting across the open ground, carrying the scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off. I kept the mule steady, taking the longer route through the stands of pine. We reached the cabin before the sky went to copper. Clara carried in the lighter goods while I hauled the rest to the lean-to. When I stepped inside, May was humming near the fire, tracing her finger through the steam on the kettle lid. Clara was setting the sugar tin high on the shelf. After supper, I told Clara about Thomas's words. She didn't startle, just leaned back in her chair, her eyes on the flames. "They've been on our trail before," she said finally. "Never this far west. Maybe the snow will keep them back." Maybe, I said, though both of us knew the kind of men who wouldn't let winter stop their search. The days that followed brought a deeper cold. The creek froze solid in parts, and the mule's breath steamed in thick clouds during the morning chores. Clara kept the cabin in good order, her sewing neat, her cooking plain, but filling. May began to laugh more often, chasing the hen that had taken to wandering the porch. Still, there were signs. Once, returning from the trap line, I found boot prints by the lower fence, too large to be mine, and too fresh for comfort. Another morning, Clara noticed a curl of smoke on the far ridge where no homestead stood. We didn't speak of it right away, but that night I barred the door and set the rifle within easy reach. One evening, as the snow fell in thick, slow flakes, a sound cut through the stillness, hoofbeats, steady and unhurried, coming down the frozen trail. Clara's hand went to May's shoulder, guiding her toward the back room. The steps drew closer, then stopped. A shadow crossed the window, tall and broad. I opened the door a crack. A man stood there, his hat brim low, snow clinging to the shoulders of his coat. His voice was deep, caring without effort. "Evenin'. Mule threw a shoe up the road. Wondered if you had tools I could use." I looked past him into the dark, but the snow hid what might have followed. "Tools are in the barn," I said, keeping my tone steady. He tipped his hat in thanks, but his eyes lingered past my shoulder toward the warm light inside. I stepped out and closed the door behind me. We walked to the barn without talk, the snow crunching underfoot. Inside, I lit the lantern, its glow catching the lines on his face weathered, but his eyes sharp. "You live alone?" he asked, setting the saddle on a rail. "Most days," I answered, handing him the tools. He worked quick, too quick for someone unfamiliar with the trade. When he was done, he thanked me again and rode off into the dark without looking back. I watched until the sound of hoofbeats was gone, then stayed outside longer than the cold allowed, listening for anything else on the wind. When I stepped back inside, Clara was standing by the table, May close beside her. She didn't ask what was said, and I didn't offer it. But the firelight caught the tight set of her jaw, and I knew she'd seen enough men like him to understand the weight of his visit. That night, sleep came light. Every creak of the timbers, every gust against the shutters brought my eyes open. Just before dawn, I thought I heard the distant sound of a horse again. But it faded into the wind before I could be sure. By morning, the sky had cleared to a pale blue, the kind that made the snow glare like glass. I went about the chores, but my eyes kept drifting to the ridge where the pines stood black against the white. Something in the air said the quiet we'd held on to was thinning. The days grew shorter, and the cold pressed in heavier with each night. I kept the rifle within reach, leaning in the shadow by the door, and the lantern trimmed low to save oil. Clara moved quieter than before, her eyes drifting often to the window, listening as if the snow itself might carry sound. May clung closer to her, the cheer she'd found here, now muted. A week after the stranger's visit, I went to check the far fence line. Snow had drifted against it, and the top rails wore a thin crust of ice. I found fresh hoof marks, deep in the powder, cutting a wide circle around the back pasture. They hadn't come from the road, no wagon tracks, just a single horse. The prints led off toward the ridge and vanished where the wind had swept the ground clean. When I returned, Clara was mending one of May's dresses by the fire. I told her what I'd seen, and she set the needle down slow. "They're searching," she said, not lifting her eyes. "It won't be long before they try the door." That night, I kept to the chair by the hearth, dozing in half sleep, the firelight flickering across the walls. Somewhere near midnight, a sharp rap came at the door. Not the hesitant knock of a neighbor, but the flat sound of someone who didn't care if they woke the house. I rose, took the rifle, and opened it a crack. 2 men stood outside. The first wore a sheepskin coat, his beard thick and black. The second was leaner, with a scar pulling one corner of his mouth. Snow clung to their boots, but their eyes stayed on the room behind me. "We're looking for a woman and a girl," the bearded one said. "Passed through here not long ago. Might have taken shelter. There's no one here but me." I told him, keeping my frame in the gap. He glanced past me again. "Mind if we step in and warm ourselves?" "I do," I said. "There's a boarding house in town. You can find a bed there." For a moment, the only sound was the wind scraping snow across the porch boards. Then the lean one spoke, voice low. "You sure you want to turn away help when trouble comes?" "I'm sure," I said. They traded a look, then turned back into the dark without another word. I watched them until they were swallowed by the trees. The cold air they'd left behind lingered in the doorway, even after I shut it. By morning, Clara had already packed 2 satchels, one with food and water, the other with spare clothes. "If they come back in numbers, we'll have to move," she said. I knew she was right, though the thought of leading them into the open sat heavy in my gut. We waited 3 more days. On the 4th, tracks appeared again by the creek, more than before, some boot, some hoof. I checked the barn, the shed, even the loft above the lean-to, but found nothing else. Still, the signs were enough. That evening, after the sun dropped behind the ridge, we loaded the sled. The plan was to head west toward Carson's Bluff, where the land broke into gullies and pines thick enough to hide a trail. I knew a man there. Eli Turner, 50, kept a trapper's cabin and owed me more than one favor. The snow had eased, and a hard crust made the going faster. We kept to the shadow of the ridges, avoiding open ground. May sat wrapped in both blankets, her breath clouding the air. Clara kept her hand on the girl's back, her other arm braced against the sled's side. The mule's hooves crunched over ice, each sound sharper in the night air. It was near midnight when we reached the old timber bridge over Cottonwood Creek. The boards groaned under the sled's weight, and halfway across the mule froze. I stepped forward, running a hand along its neck, when a voice called from the far side. "Evenin' again," the voice said. The stranger from the week before stepped into the open, his coat catching the moonlight. Behind him, 2 more riders emerged, their horses stamping in the frost. Clara shifted closer to May, her face set. "You're a long way from your fence line," the man said, his eyes glinting. I kept my voice even. "And you're a long way from fixing a mule shoe." One of the riders chuckled, but the stranger didn't smile. "We'll be taking the lady and the girl now. Best you step aside." The air felt colder than the snow underfoot. I eased my coat open just enough to show the rifle barrel in my hand. "Best you ride on," I said. For a moment, no one moved. Then the stranger nodded once, a slow tilt of his head. "Not tonight, then," he said, turning his horse. They backed into the trees without haste, as if the night itself would keep them close. We crossed the rest of the bridge without speaking. The moonlight faded as clouds moved in and the wind picked up through the pines. By the time Eli's cabin came into view, the sky was heavy with snow again. Eli opened the door with a lantern in hand, his beard streaked with white eyes narrowing at the sight of Clara and May. "You'd better come in," he said, stepping aside. "And tell me what trouble's on your heels." I knew there'd be no more keeping it quiet. Whatever came next, the trail behind us was too warm now to cool on its own. Eli's cabin smelled of wood smoke and boiled coffee. The walls were hung with traps and pelts, each one cured to a stiff gloss. Clara kept close to May while I told Eli about the men at the bridge. He listened without interruption, his jaw working as if on gristle. When I finished, he set his cup down and said, "They're not just drifting through. Sounds like they've been sent." His eyes moved to Clara. "That right?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around May's shoulder. "They're from the ranch," she said quietly. "From my husband's people. They don't like that I left, and they don't like that I took her." Eli leaned back in his chair. "If they want you bad enough, they'll try again. Might not matter how far you run." We stayed that night in his loft, the 3 of us wrapped in quilts that smelled faintly of cedar. I woke before first light to the sound of Eli pulling on his boots. He was heading to town, said he'd talk to Sheriff Dobbs, see what could be done without drawing too much attention. By noon, he returned, his coat dusted with snow. "Dobbs says he'll send a deputy to keep an eye on the road," Eli told us, "but he won't stir up a fight unless something happens in plain sight." That meant we were on our own for the most part. 2 quiet days passed. Then on the 3rd, the stillness broke. A rider came hard down the frozen track, his horse blowing steam in the cold. Eli stepped out before he reached the door. The man, a young ranch hand named Wade Larkin, pulled up, glancing past Eli toward the cabin. "They're at the bluff," Wade said. "3 of them. Been asking at the trading post if anyone's seen a woman with dark hair and a little girl. Told folks they were family runaway wife and child." Eli looked to me. "Sounds like you've got hours, maybe less." We set to moving. The sled was no good over the rocky pass west of the bluff, so we packed light for horseback. Eli saddled 2 of his bay's sturdy animals with more stamina than speed. Clara rode with May in front of her, and I kept alongside with Eli, trailing to cover our back. The wind off the ridge cut like a blade, carrying the smell of pine and distant smoke. By mid-afternoon, we reached a narrow cut between 2 high slopes. Snow had drifted deep here, and the horses labored with each step. Halfway through, a voice rang out from the rocks above. "Hold there." The bearded man from before stood on the ridge, rifle in hand. 2 others appeared at his side, one with a rope coiled at his hip. Clara pulled May close, her face pale. Eli's voice was calm, but carried across the gap. "Best you boys think twice about this. Ain't no profit in taking what's not yours." The bearded man spat into the snow. "She is his, and the girl too." Before I could speak, a crack split the air. Snow puffed from the rock near my stirrup where the bullet struck. The horses skittered, and May let out a cry. Eli swung down and took cover behind a boulder, his own rifle coming free. "Go!" he barked. I spurred my horse forward, Clara's mount keeping pace. The pass twisted, giving us brief cover before it opened into a grove of pines. Branches whipped past as we pushed through, the sound of shouts echoing behind. We didn't stop until the trees thinned and a frozen creek barred the way. Clara's horse balked at the ice, but Eli caught up and led it across, testing each step. On the far bank, we turned west again, the ridge now between us and the men. By dusk, we reached an abandoned line shack Eli knew. It was little more than a single room with a stone hearth and a roof that sagged in the middle, but it gave shelter from the wind. We set a small fire and ate bread and jerky in near silence. "They'll be searching the other side of the ridge," Eli said. "Might buy us a day, maybe 2. After that, we need a plan that ends this." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the firelight dancing across the floor. I could see she was thinking of more than the next day's ride. Outside, the wind had eased, leaving only the creak of the old timbers and the faint rustle of the pines. Somewhere out there, the men were still moving their trail, drawing closer again with each hour. I knew the next choice we made would decide whether we kept running or turned to face them. The fire in the line shack had burned down to embers by the time I woke. Eli was already at the door, coat on, looking east through the pines. Clara stirred beside the hearth, her arms still draped protectively over May. "They've circled back," Eli said when I joined him outside. "Saw a sign in the snow, tracks from 3 horses, light load, moving quick." He tipped his chin toward the ridge. "They're closing in again." We packed without speaking much. The cold bit deep, and our breath hung in the air. Clara settled May on her lap once more, pulling the girl's scarf snug. Eli led us west, skirting the frozen creek until it opened onto a narrow trail lined with black spruce. By midday, we reached a fork. The left trail led toward the mining road, broad enough for a fast ride, but open and easy to spot from a distance. The right was barely more than a game track winding into steeper country. Eli studied both before nodding toward the narrow way. It was slow going. Snow clung to the branches, dropping in sudden heavy clumps when the wind shook them loose. I kept my eyes moving, scanning for any flicker of movement through the trees. Just before dusk, we found shelter in a shallow cave above a frozen gully. Inside, the air was still and dry, smelling faintly of old smoke from some hunter's fire years back. Eli set a small blaze and warmed beans in a dented pot. Clara kept May close, her gaze fixed on the shadows at the cave's mouth. Eli and I took turns keeping watch that night. Around the middle of my turn, I caught the sound, faint at first, then clear enough to set my nerves tight. Hoofbeats. They stopped somewhere below, maybe 100 yards off. Low voices carried words lost in the wind, then faded. Come morning, we didn't linger. We rode hard for the next rise, hoping the higher ground would give us a view. From the crest, I could see smoke in the distance, thin curling lines from cook fires. A camp. Clara's face tightened. It's them. They always make camp near water. Eli studied the lay of the land, tracing the line of the creek that cut past their camp. If we head south along the ridge, we can pass unseen. But if they've posted a lookout... He let the thought hang. We made the move. Hoof steps muffled in the snow, we followed the ridge until the camp was well behind us. But just as the trees began to thin, a figure stepped from behind a trunk ahead. Rifle in hand. Hold there, he said, voice low but steady. It wasn't the bearded man this time. This one was younger, maybe 20, with a clean face and eyes that didn't quite match the hardness in his tone. He looked at Clara, then at May. You don't have to do this, Clara told him, her voice calm. Just step aside. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone else to appear. Eli's voice stayed even. You walk away now, son, and no one will come looking for you. The young man swallowed, then lowered his rifle a fraction. You didn't hear it from me, he said, but they aim to take the girl first. Figure you'll follow. Without another word, he stepped aside, letting us pass. Clara didn't look back. By the time the sun dropped low, we'd put another few miles between us and the camp. We stopped at the edge of an old homestead, nothing left but a leaning barn and a half-collapsed corral. Eli led the horses inside for shelter, and we settled in the loft. Snow began to fall thick and quiet. Through the gaps in the boards, I watched the white cover the ground, hiding our trail, one flake at a time. Still, I knew snow wouldn't stop what was coming. Eli pulled his coat tighter. They're not going to quit. Sooner or later, this ends face to face. His words hung in the cold air. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere far off, a single hoofbeat echoed before fading into silence. By morning, the snow had stopped leaving the ground, covered in a white crust that crunched underfoot. Eli and I saddled the horses in the leaning barn, our breath puffing in pale clouds. Clara held May close, wrapping her in an extra blanket before lifting her into the saddle. We set out just after first light, keeping to the tree line, where the drifts were thinner. The cold air sharpened every sound, the creak of leather, the muffled thud of hooves. Eli led, scanning the ridges while I kept watch behind. The sky was clear, but I had the uneasy sense we were being measured from somewhere out of sight. By midday, the land began to rise toward a narrow pass. The snow was deeper here, slowing the horses. That's when Eli spotted the tracks fresh cutting across our path. 2 riders, heavy horses, headed toward the pass ahead. They're trying to box us in, he said, voice low. We turned off the trail, guiding the horses into a shallow ravine. The banks rose on either side, thick with brush and scrub oak. It gave us cover, but made for slow travel. Clara never once complained, her eyes fixed ahead, jaw set. An hour later, we heard the sound hoofbeats coming down the ridge, echoing between the slopes. We dismounted and led the horses deeper into the ravine, crouching low beneath the branches. 2 men rode past on the ridge above, their shapes dark against the snow. One was the bearded man Clara had spoken of before, the other, broad-shouldered, his rifle resting across the saddle horn. They didn't see us. We waited until their shapes disappeared over the rise before moving again. The ravine bent west, leading us toward a frozen creek. The ice groaned under the horses' hooves, but it held. We followed the creek until the banks widened into a small flat. An old line cabin sat at the far edge, its roof sagging under the snow. Eli checked the door. It opened with a groan. Inside, the air was cold but dry. and a pile of wood sat in the corner. We built a small fire and ate in silence, the warmth easing the stiffness from our hands. Clara laid May on a blanket near the hearth. The girl's breathing was steady now, the color back in her cheeks. Just as the light began to fade, a shadow crossed the doorway. My hand went to my revolver, but it was the young man we'd seen before, the one who had let us pass. His eyes flicked to Clara, then to Eli. "They're moving tonight," he said quietly. "Gonna take the ridge north and swing down behind you. I can slow them, but not for long." Eli studied him for a moment. "Why tell us?" The young man shifted his weight. "Ain't the first time they've done this. Just the first time I've had reason to care." He didn't wait for thanks. He turned and disappeared into the snow, his tracks already fading in the dim light. We doused the fire and packed quickly. The moon was just rising when we left the cabin, casting a silver sheen over the snow. The cold bit harder now, but the darkness was our ally. We rode north, keeping the creek to our right, until the land opened into a wide meadow. On the far side, the pines rose like a dark wall. Eli led us into them, following a barely visible trail. We didn't stop until the night was deep and the cold so sharp it burned in the lungs. We made camp in a sheltered hollow, no fire this time, just blankets and the quiet rustle of wind through the trees. I lay awake, listening for any sound beyond the night's breathing. Somewhere out there, the bearded man and his partner were still hunting. And now, with the young man's warning fresh in my mind, I knew the next move would come soon. By dawn, the cold had settled deep into my bones. The snow around our camp was unbroken, save for the faint marks where our horses had stood. Eli was already saddled when I rose, his breath a slow plume in the still air. Clara and May were ready soon after, their faces pale but steady. We kept north, following the trail through the pines until the land dropped toward the flats. That's where we saw them, two riders moving slow, scanning the tree line. The bearded man led the broad-shouldered one behind. They hadn't spotted us yet. Eli motioned us to stay back. He slipped from the saddle and moved along a ridge, rifle in hand. The young man from before appeared at the far end, drawing the riders' attention with a shout. They turned toward him, rifles swinging. That's when Eli stepped out, his shot ringing sharp in the cold. The broad-shouldered man toppled from his saddle, snow puffing around him. The bearded man wheeled his horse, but the young man blocked his path. Clara's voice was firm as she told him it was over, that there'd be no more running. The man dropped his gun into the snow. We rode into town by midday, the sheriff waiting on the boardwalk. He took the prisoners without a word, only nodding toward Clara and May. Folks gathered, their faces lined with the kind of relief that comes when fear finally lifts. That evening, we sat in the lamplight of the small boarding house. May leaned against her mother, her eyes half closed. Clara's hand stayed over her daughter's, as if afraid to let go. The young man sat across from us, his hat in his hands, saying little. When it was time to part, Clara thanked Eli and me, her voice low. "We've got a place to start fresh now," she said. "That's enough." She and May boarded the morning coach, the young man beside them. As for me, I stayed a while longer, helping Eli see the matter closed with the circuit judge. The snow began to melt in the days that followed, the earth showing through in dark patches. Life in town eased back to its rhythm wagons on the main road, children's laughter carrying from the schoolhouse. Out here, the land doesn't promise fairness. But every now and then, it lets you set something right. That's all a person can ask for. If you've ever known what it means to stand your ground until the dust settles, then you understand. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who could use the reminder.